Our next presenter is Patrick Ball, and he's the Chief Scientist and Vice President of the Human Rights Program at Benetech. He's a leading innovator in applying scientific measurement to human rights. He has spent several decades designing databases and conducting quantitative analysis for truth commissions, non-governmental organizations, and international criminal tribunals. He has been around the world working on the area of human rights and is currently involved in projects in Guatemala, Colombia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Discussing Patrick, do you mind coming up, Andrew? And Kiyo, there they are. People are collecting still.
You'll get graphs on your head, though, if you sit there. So.
Oh, do you not want them to sit? Would that be easier?
They can sit there. I mean,
okay. Why don't they sit in the audience, and then will you do us a favor of afterwards coming up? Is that all right? And so our two discussants. The first is Andrew Herscher, who is Associate Professor of Architecture here at the University of Michigan, and Tsutsui, who is Associate Professor of Sociology. So with that, I'll turn it over to Patrick.
Thank you very much. It is such a pleasure to be in Ann Arbor. 15 years ago next week, I defended my PhD here, and I have not been back since then. So it's a great pleasure, and I think it was a pleasure for my committee when I defended the dissertation, since I had begun it 9 years earlier. It took me a long time, and I'll give some excuses for that as I give this talk today. I went off and did other things. But taking so long to finish my PhD was stressful, of course, for the committee, but I and my colleagues in graduate school at the time in sociology would often assure them, we said, no, look, graduate school is not a race. It's an ethnicity. So with that, let me go on and talk a little bit about some of the work that I've been doing for the last couple of decades. As was mentioned in the introduction, I've worked for truth commissions, for non-government organizations, for international criminal tribunals, for UN missions. And the piece that ties this work together, I think, the thing that we focus on when we're trying to understand large-scale patterns is a notion of witness, is the idea that somebody's going to tell us something. Somebody's going to tell us something useful about what's happened. And it may be to them, it may be to people that they've been colleagues with or their community that they're helping to represent. This man, Suleiman Gwengweng, is the leader of a political prisoners group in Chad who's accumulated and aggregated astonishing testimonies about the violence suffered by prisoners under Hassan Habre in the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s. And the point of this witness, the point of this observation, I think, is to understand what that witness is trying to tell us, is to get a very experiential, a very subjective, a very individual sense of what that person saw, what they've learned, what they can then tell us. But the problem is that for analysis and advocacy, we have to put that in context. We have to make a series of judgments about what that witness is telling us. And so when we're doing qualitative analysis, which is what I'm going to be advocating throughout this talk as I talk about statistics, the foundation for the qualitative analysis, the reason that we believe it's true, is that we embed the argument in context, in history, in judgment, and in a series of things that we know for some reason about this place. Yes, statistics are different than that. When we make a statistical or quantitative claim, we're saying this claim exists in some sense apart from the person doing the claiming. We're saying that it is objective. It is something I can put out on the table. And I cannot tell you how many times I have been in meetings with people with rich experiential knowledge about a situation, about a context. Most recently, this happened to me many times in the Congo. People would come back from a small village and they'd say, you know, we know what's going on here. We've got these 4 different ethnicities. They're contending. This guy was involved in this other conflict, but he's come in here because of the artisanal mining that he's now trying to dominate. No, but it's coming. Very, very detailed, very subtle arguments about what's going on in this place. And then someone comes and puts a graph on the table, and all the brains drain out of the room. And they go, look at the graph. It went up, and now it goes down. Like, really? Really? That's what we're going to reduce human rights argument to? And so what I want to do in this talk is make a very strong argument for the integration of quantitative reasoning and this rich substantive knowledge, which I find so frequent in the human rights space. And then I want to tell you about why I think that's really hard to do. Essential, but very, very hard to do. And the weaknesses of the statistical side. So what we're trying to do when we're understanding a situation is we're going to receive reports. We're going to get this witness. We're going to hear from people. We may conduct investigations on specific cases. We may go out in the field. We'll do the investigation both through direct interviews. We may collect forensic information. May get remote sensing data. We're going to keep records. All right? We may make up a database. And then we're going to try to draw some conclusions about the conditions. We're going to say things are getting better or things are getting worse. We're going to say that there are regional differences. It's much worse in the north, but in the south, things are relatively quiet. We're going to make claims about relative perpetrator responsibility. We think this group is the one that's really a problem, or maybe some other group. And in the best cases, we may be able to use some of that as evidence in criminal tribunals holding those who are most responsible. Most responsible, we will hold them criminally accountable for their actions. Okay, it turns out that's really, really hard. And the reason that it's hard is that monitoring cases does not actually lead directly to statistical understanding. And I put this photograph up because these are a bunch of colleagues of mine from an NGO that in Guatemala. We worked on this project, the International Center for Human Rights Research, for about 10 years. We gathered information on over 37,000 deaths. We read every copy of every newspaper published in Guatemala from 1960 to 1996 and extracted the reports of every single violent death reported in every single one of those newspapers over this entire period. Okay? We worked really hard. There were over 100 students that were organized in this project by the leadership that's represented there. And I wrote a book from those results, a book about which I am now very skeptical. And the reason that I'm skeptical is that what that book talks about is what we learned in those investigations. And unfortunately, statistical results are a function of the monitoring capacity that we have to learn things. They are not necessarily a representation of what happened in the world. And this distinction between what we can capture and what is true turns out to be really, really hard. It's a very, very problematic situation. Unless we collect witness information from randomly selected respondents, as is happening in the photograph here, actually, from a project that randomly selected respondents from villages around Amritsar in India to talk to them about disappearances. Unless we select witness from randomly selected respondents, or we model the probability with which each of those respondents is reporting those events, what we extract from the information is not a statistically reliable measure of the true patterns and magnitude of violence. And so this notion of using witness as a literal basis for statistics is very problematic. It can be quite misleading. And by witness, I mean everything from Truth Commission testimonies to UN investigations to press articles to crowdsourcing, NGO reporting, whether we're talking about Human Rights Watch or tiny NGOs like the Guatemalan group I showed in the previous slide, social media feeds, perpetrator records, even government registries are all partial and therefore statistically, not politically, but statistically biased representations of patterns of violence. And let me give you a more abstract sense of the problem. Let's imagine that we collect and combine three databases. So in this example, we've collected press data. For example, in the big circle, we've collected direct interview data in the smaller circle, and as an example, information from other NGOs in the medium-sized circle. And we've, through, I will tell you, enormous effort, combined the three, identifying the cases in common so we can get a sense of the intersecting circles. And our interest is in the union of those circles. The question then is, what lies outside the circles we can observe? What lies in the gray area, not just in the white area? Is the gray area that we are unable to observe like the situation on the left, in which we observe perhaps a third of reality? Or is the world like the situation on the right, where we observe almost all of it? Which of these is the accurate picture? The reason this is so important is that different parts of the same reality can be in different parts of this ratio of representation, this ratio of capture, of information capture. In Peru, in the Truth Commission, what we discovered, combining government reports of homicides with reports collected by the Truth Commission and reports collected by non-governmental organizations, we found that we had knowledge of only about half, or a little bit more than half, of all homicides committed by Sendero Luminoso, the Maoist guerrillas, while we had information on nearly all of the homicides committed by the Peruvian army. This reality notwithstanding, the raw number of cases observed attributed to the two perpetrators was roughly equal. So what we have is roughly equal. What is true is very different. If we had made a conclusion about the relative responsibility of these two parties based on what we simply observed, we would have gotten the story terribly wrong. We would have assumed that the two parties were roughly equal in responsibility, when in fact Sendero Luminoso was enormously worse. They committed many, many more killings. So we can get the story terribly, terribly wrong if we read data in a literal way. So why does this happen? I'll give you just a few examples from things that I've observed over the last 10 or 12 years that I've been really worrying about this problem. One is that a monitoring organization's resources change. So let's imagine that we're the small office of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in the Congo, and we are working in Dungu, which is a town in northeastern Congo, which is the center point for monitoring activities by the Lord's Resistance Army. And our job then is to monitor what the LRA is up to, which is a really important job, in my opinion. There are 6 of us. And so let's hypothesize that in March, we work very, very hard. We go out in the field whenever we can get the military guys to support us, because we can only go out in the field when the military guys are willing to go with us. Those are UN rules. We go out in the field, we investigate a bunch of cases, we get 100 cases, we document them very thoroughly, we send them to Kinshasa, Kinshasa processes them, sends them on to New York, and the analysts working for the Security Council folks say, right, 100 cases, the LRA in March. Okay, 100 cases. In April, this is, after all, the UN, right? So half of us go on leave. Okay? So there's 3 of us working in this office. And in April, nonetheless, the 3 of us who remain work very, very hard. And we go out in the field whenever we can. We document cases. We take photographs. We collect whatever other information we can gather from Congolese NGOs. We document 40 cases. We process these cases. We send them to Kinshasa. They do a bit of analysis. They send it on to New York. And when it gets to New York, the guy at the staff guy for the Security Council gets us and says, wow, 40 cases, right, in April. There were 100 in March. Things are getting better. Now, I hope that the flaw in that reasoning is immediately obvious to you, right? All that's happened is that our monitoring capacity was cut in half, and therefore the number of cases we reported was cut in half. But I have to say, that's how the Security Council makes policy right now. In an entirely literal way. They make policy reading specifically what is documented. And so as our ability to project knowledge, or the ability to capture knowledge, as that changes, the actual quantitative amount of knowledge that we recover changes as well. And that can change because our staffing changes, because our logistical capacity changes, because our budgets change, because our technical ability, our tools change. Every time a cell tower gets built in northeastern Congo, we get a little better ability to capture information from that region, but still, we're just scratching the surface. Similarly, if our relationships to the local population change, if there's another scandal accusing UN staff of patronizing child prostitutes or exploiting children, if that happens again, people will become increasingly reluctant to talk to us. Our ability to capture information will decline, and it will seem as though conditions are improving, when in fact simply our ability to capture information is degrading. If we offer incentives to victims, we will get more information. As we change that structure of incentives, we'll get information. This is particularly interesting now in the DRC with respect to sexual violence, where, in my opinion, quite rightly, the world now attends to sexual violence and conflict. So the way the international community attends to that is by putting resources into it. We are trying to build health clinics. We are trying to build psychological assistance clinics. We are trying to offer vocational and other social services to people in these regions, particularly to victims. So people who identify themselves as victims can get those services and do so. And a rational victim, in an economist sense of rational, will go and get her medical services here, her psychological services here, her vocational services in another place. Now, if we step back and say we're trying to understand how much sexual violence there is, what we might do is count the number of cases. Since we've invested so much in all these different service provision agencies, one way to understand is we'll go to the medical clinic and say, how many cases are you treating? We'll go to the psychological clinic, we'll say, how many cases are you treating, and so forth. And we'll aggregate the number of cases across all of these clinics, thereby multiply counting all the people who went to each of the clinics. So we count many, many, too many cases. Of course, we also count far too few cases, because a tiny fraction of all the possible victims come to any clinic. So we have a number that's both too high and too low, which is to say we have a number that doesn't mean anything at all. This is what the UNFPA does, by the way, for counting sexual violence in Congo. It's exactly the process I just told you. And worst of all, when the security situation changes, our ability to capture information changes as well. We cannot capture information in the worst of violence. There are some exceptions to that. I have to say I have profound respect for the Syrian activists who capture video on their cell phones and put it on YouTube. That is astonishing. But it is generally the case that in the worst security situations, our ability to capture information is at a low point. And so it may seem, as violence gets much worse, our statistics go down. So how bad is it? It's really bad. Let me give you some examples. So this is Guatemala. And these are data from the NGO that I showed a photograph of earlier. And in the three trend lines shown on this graph, I show the killings reported by the press in the blue line here, as well as killings reported by two other sources, interview and documentary sources. And what's astonishing to me about this line is that at the point in the early 1980s when, according to the Commission for Historical Clarification, the Guatemalan army was committing acts of genocide against the Mayan people, the line from the press goes down. And killings go into the tens of thousands, but the press line goes down. Now, it's clear that the press is never able to cover more than a few hundred cases per year. That may be just its ability to cover things. But what I think is important about this graph is that we capture not just a small fraction, but an entirely uncorrelated fraction. There is no statistical relationship in the variation of the press reports with the other reports. We can think of all sorts of reasons that would happen in the press, but that should give us pause when people offer us aggregations from press sources as though they were statistically valid representations of reality. We'll move on to Kosovo and look at regional variations. Here are three sources from Kosovo: Human Rights Watch, a series of Albanian and Kosovo NGOs that were assisted by the American Bar Association in the second graph, and then in the third, data collected by about 4,000 interviews collected by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And I got all these data, and I have disaggregated them by, these are only killings, disaggregated them by region. And what we find here is that the proportion of killings found in the East in Human Rights Watch is 4% relative to what the OSCE thinks is 46%. Which is it? What fraction of all killings occurred in the East? Since regional distribution is one of the keys to understanding the costs of our conflict, it's essential to be able to know what this number is. Now, we might say, well, maybe the number lies somewhere in between. Is that a reasonable conclusion? I hope people are shaking their heads. It's not a reasonable conclusion at all. We have no way of knowing what the number is. In fact, these data sources provide us literally no information about what that distribution is. And that should give us great pause when we think about the astonishingly vast amount of political science that's based on these kinds of sources. Sierra Leone, two very good projects, in my opinion, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the leading non-governmental organization in Freetown, the Campaign for Good Governance, again, documenting killings during the civil conflict by linguistic group, the Mende versus the Temne, and we ask, one of the questions that's important in Sierra Leone is who were the majority of the victims? And we get two quite different answers from these two sources. The point of doing quantitative reasoning in human rights is comparison. We want to understand patterns over time. We want to compare patterns over ethnicity. We want to compare patterns over region, over perpetrator. And to understand a pattern, we need each component of the analysis, each region, each ethnicity, each point in time, each gender. We need those to be relatively unbiased relative to each other. They need to both be good representations, unbiased representations of the underlying reality. If they're not, then the conclusions we draw have more to do with our data collection mechanism than with the underlying reality. And that turns out to be true more often than not. Most aggregated analyses are implicitly statistical. And I want to highlight here, particularly maps and data visualizations. They don't look like graphs, but they are. If you have a map that's got a big dot here and a little dot here, the point of putting those dots on the maps is to say big dot more, little dot less. Right? That's the point of that kind of representation on a map. But if the big dot simply represents where the cell towers are still functioning, and the small tower tells us where the cell towers were not functioning, we have not learned what we thought we learned. We have been misled. And so selection bias, the technical process of making some information more visible to us than others, is a big problem. Now, this is not the counsel of despair. Rigorous, reliable statistics are possible, but they're hard. Getting good statistics is not like Sesame Street, where we freeze the frame and count the stuff. That's not how statistics come about. Instead, we have only 3 ways to get to good statistics. One is complete administrative statistics. If we have perfect data, we can do anything we like. Now, this doesn't happen very often, and in practice, not really at all. It does. There are a few human rights situations where this turns out to be true. Killings in Northern Ireland, killings in Israel-Palestine, killings in Bosnia now. We actually have an almost perfect census. But these are very rare, they're expensive, and the only way to know that you've gotten there, the only way to know that you've established a near-perfect census is by using one of the other 2 methods, either a probability sample survey in which you can get a random sample of the underlying population and make an estimate, or a statistical projection from databases. And I'm going to give an example of each, although I think I'm probably going to run out of time, so I'm only going to give one example. So first, I'm going to talk about modeling databases. And this example comes from, both of the examples come from Guatemala. In this case, this is an example from the Commission for Historical Clarification, in which we wanted to know how many Guatemalans have been killed in the armed internal conflict. And we did so by using a technique called multiple systems estimation. There's one graph of algebra. I do not think this is an algebra-friendly crowd, but nonetheless, let's go through it very quickly. The notion is that if we have a list of deaths, which we'll call A, which is drawn from a population which we don't know, called N, the probability that a given death is documented by Project A is A divided by N. Okay? Similarly, the probability that a given death is documented by a second project independently done from A is B divided by N. Now, if we're able to combine the 2 sources and identify which cases are in common between the 2, which turns out to be very hard but doable, we'll call that M, the cases that are in common, the intersection of the 2 projects. Well, that's simply M over N. The probability that a death is in 2 is M over N. But the probability that a death is in 2 projects turns out to be equal to the probability of being in the first multiplied by the probability of being in the second, by basic probability theory. So the probability of being in M is equal to the probability of being in A multiplied by B. M over N equals A over N times B over N. You can rearrange the terms and get an estimate of N, which is still unknown, so it has a little hat over it, which equals AB over M. And this method has been used to adjust censuses and estimate wildlife populations for over 100 years. It's a very well-known estimator. In 2 systems with only A and B, there are a lot of assumptions that have to be made. When you have 3, 4, 5, or in the project I did with 2 of my colleagues, I'm happy to see here today, in Casanare, Colombia, we used 16 independent systems. So you can use quite a few more systems. The math gets a lot harder. When you put the systems all together, you get a sort of complicated intersection diagram like this. And from that, using a variation on the math shown in the previous slide, we can make an estimate of both what we observe, in this case 47,706 deaths, and an estimate of what we cannot observe. And that is it has a confidence interval around it, which we can interpret by the standard methods. Now, there's a series of limitations in this method, which I'd be happy to talk about in the question and answer. But as I said in the earlier slide, the point of statistics is not magnitude, it's pattern. The point of statistics is to come up with comparisons among categories. And in Guatemala, one of the most fundamental comparisons is to look at the 6 regions in which the anthropologists, lawyers, historians, journalists, psychologists, and other experts had determined that acts of genocide had been committed. There are 6 of those regions. And ask, what are the relative rates of crude mortality due to homicide for indigenous versus non-indigenous people between 1981 and 1983 in each of these 6 regions. So there was a census in Guatemala in 1981. I think there are a lot of interesting questions that can be asked. Why is there a census immediately before a genocide? Bill Seltzer has done some terrific work on that. But thanks to that census, we know how many indigenous and non-indigenous people were alive in each of these 6 regions in 1981. By using the methods I suggested in the previous few slides, we can make an estimate of how many deaths there were in total. With a bit of division, we get a crude mortality rate, and we can say that in Region 1, between 1981 and 1983, slightly more than 40% of all the indigenous people were killed in that period. By comparison, a bit more than 8% of the non-indigenous people were killed. If genocide had been committed, we would expect to see a pattern of this kind. Genocide is not the only possible explanation for this pattern, by any means. There are many other explanations. However, making the finding that these data are consistent with the hypothesis that genocide occurred helps to strengthen the conclusion that is made on many other grounds. And I think that, coming back to my earlier point, the need for integrating qualitative and quantitative reasoning, I think that the work at the Guatemalan Truth Commission is perhaps the single best example that we have in the human rights world of the effective integration of these 2 techniques. I found that, to this day, still the most intellectually exciting experience of my life because of the richness of the debate and dialogue between legal scholars, anthropologists. Guatemala is particularly rich in anthropologists, so anthropology played an especially important role there. Historians, economists, and many other experts. But the point was that we did not privilege any specific kind of argument, but rather tried to find ways that each kind of argument helped us come to this common conclusion. We can talk more about how that specifically worked if there are questions. But the point is that this graph does not speak for itself in the sense that we often think that quantitative work can objectively. There can be many other explanations for the tremendous disproportionality in the mortality rate between indigenous and non-indigenous people in these 6 regions. Rather, to understand this as evidence for the claim that there was genocide, we have to embed this in these many other kinds of argument. I think that's the fundamental takeaway that I want to leave you with now, that statistics are very difficult, but possible if we do the modeling, if we do the rest of the math. Kenneth, how am I doing? Can I do another example, or am I done? Okay, let's see if we can talk about the archives. What's fascinating about Guatemala is that we keep getting more data. We keep learning things about Guatemala that we didn't know before. In 2005, an archive came to light that contains about 80 million pages of paper. And this paper turns out to be the historical records of the Guatemalan National Police, who are alleged to have committed tens of thousands of disappearances in the 1970s and 1980s. So from this work, there's a lot of very, very good work that's been done in this archive, much of which has been done by Tammy Gubrecht, sitting here in the audience. So if people want to talk to her in the break, I urge you to. She's an historian, so brings a little different view to it. But she and Danielle, sitting next to her, were central in the sampling that we did in this archive. We randomly sampled approximately 15,000 documents from this archive, doing a spatial sample, sampling random points in space. And one of the key pieces of analysis that we did in the random sample is to look at the flow of documents. Who originated each document? To whom did they send it? Who was copied? Who initialed the margins? Now, in the days of paper documentation, paper tells us the story of what the bureaucracy was doing, because it was very expensive to make copies. So the copies that we have tell us a lot about who was talking to whom and what orders they were giving and what reports were replies to those orders. Bureaucracies function by creating policies, plans, and orders from the top and being pushed down. Okay? That's what goes down. And what comes back up are reports saying, we have done what you asked. Now, this is especially important because there's a criminal case regarding the disappearance of the man in the photograph there. His name is Edgar Fernando Garcia, and in February of 1984, he left his office and did not arrive at home. He was disappeared. His widow became an extraordinary human rights activist, and as part of her activism, the birth of her activism was creating a giant paper trail around the disappearance of her husband through habeas corpus petitions that she gave to the police. Do you have him? Where is he? What investigations have you done to find him? And that helps to highlight within the police documents that ultimately helped us determine that the police were responsible for this death. But what's interesting is not just to say that two guys from the police grabbed Mr. Garcia, killed him, and hid his body. No, that's interesting, and that's very important. But what's even more important is to ask, what was the policy that led to not just the disappearance of Mr. Garcia, but to the disappearances of tens of thousands of other people? So statistics helps us not so much in a particular case, although it did offer very useful insights into this case, and Danielle was an expert witness in the first of the cases of the perpetrators of the disappearance of Mr. Garcia. But it also helps us to ask questions about command responsibility and the responsibility of policy for this crime. And so what we would expect if there is a functioning bureaucracy is a rich flow of documents that are policy plans and orders from the top to the bottom of the bureaucracy and reports that flow back up. And indeed, we do find that flow. And that, we hope, will be an input into the case of Colonel Hector Bol de la Cruz, who was the director of the National Police at the time that Mr. Garcia was disappeared. Colonel Bol de la Cruz is now in a kind of holding pattern as his defense fences with the prosecution. It's really important in human rights that we get evidence right. We found our moral claim, our moral legitimacy, and the power of our argument in advocacy and analysis is founded on the notion that we are speaking truth to power. It means it has to be true. And in statistics, that's especially hard because the temptation to mistake a whole lot of information for statistical patterns is very strong. That makes it all the more important that we bring the tools of survey research, mathematical statistics, biostatistics, demography, and other quantitative approaches to this kind of information to bear. Because we have to get it right. Because if we do, we convict the bad guys. Accountability is, in my opinion, one of the most fundamental of our goals in human rights. And if we can convict the bad guys, these are the two guys right here who were convicted of the disappearance, of actually committing materially the disappearance of Mr. Garcia. If we can do that, we bring the world many steps in the direction of a more respectful place. But it is at least as important that we bring closure and vindication to the victims. The photograph on the bottom right is of the daughter and mother of Mr. Garcia. You may remember in the previous photograph there was an infant in the arms of her mother in the photograph of Mr. Garcia. This is that woman now. She is now an important lawyer in Guatemala. She's grown up and was rightfully overjoyed at the conviction of her father's murderers. So I'll leave it there and hope that I have not left you with the sense that quantitative methods are impossible, but rather only that they are very, very difficult. Thank you. No more grass, so it won't get on.
Andrew and Kiyo, do you want to go on up and use the microphones, please? I don't know whether they're on.
Okay, then. All right, thank you for. Am I on? Thank you for including me in this really stimulating conference. It's an honor and privilege, really, to comment on Patrick Ball's work. I teach in the sociology department here, and he's a legendary figure with all his accomplishments in Truth and Reconciliation Commission, especially in his courtroom confrontation with Slobodan Milosevic. That should be, at some point immortalized in the form of a movie. I wouldn't be surprised if that happens pretty soon. I'm somebody who studies human rights and using both quantitative and qualitative methods. So what the kinds of work that we do in that intellectual community is we quantify based on information in Amnesty reports and State Department reports on human rights violations in 190 countries or so, quantify the extent of human rights violations into 5 categories or 10 categories. And for instance, in my study, I look at the patterns of ratification of international human rights treaties and compare the correlation basically between the two, controlling for all kinds of different factors that are involved at the country level. So we engage in this production of knowledge about human rights violations and the efficacy of human rights treaties and what factors affect the actual practice of human rights in various different countries. So, this knowledge that we produce may or may not be picked up by policymakers, may or may not affect the actual or shape politics in the world in various different countries. But Patrick engages in production of evidence that has more immediate impact and really shapes the immediate politics and really the history, the course of history of whatever nation he might be involved studying. So first, we didn't have anything to read, so I'm commenting on your presentation. But I wanted to ask you this question: what is the mindset of somebody who does such an important work that sees an immediate impact? We live in a sort of cynical age of fact-checking. We see presidential debates and quickly TV personalities talk about, do some fact-checking. And next morning you pick up a New York Times and then there's more fact-checking of fact-checkers. And then you go on the web and there's a third layer of fact-checking of fact-checkers. And this is going to be ultimate fact-checking that you're engaged in. And in this sort of political presidential debates kind of discourse, the objectivity of fact checkers are important, and a lot of them try to appear at least as objective and claim non-partisanship. But a lot of those people get criticized for being biased for Democrats or for Republicans, and you are involved in that kind of arena, even more dangerous, I would say, realm. And how do you go about doing this? You obviously care about human rights, and I'm sure you have very little sympathy with folks like Milosevic and all those violators, but at the same time, you have to appear objective and counter any kind of allegations of bias toward victims of rights. And I wonder how you go about doing it, how you make your claim to objectivity when you present all this evidence that you produce. That's one question. And also, you didn't talk too much about Truth and Reconciliation Commissions today, but in your work with Truth Commissions, and you've worked in a number of Truth Commissions, do you care what happens afterwards? I'm sure you do care, but does that interfere with your work? Do you have to know, do you have to kind of have some idea of what might happen because of the kinds of evidence you produce? Or does that, do you think that might affect your work, that might bias your work, so you actually should not care about that and focus more on this processing and translation and production of evidence? I wonder how you go about doing it when you process all these data points that you get. So that's generally about your work. On your presentation, the multiple estimation method. Sounds pretty good to me, but your presentation was both frightening and encouraging at the same time. It's frightening in the way that evidence is used in the Security Council or the UN or any kind of international policy-making forums. That's truly scary, what you described. But at the same time, it's encouraging that producer of that evidence, Patrick, is aware of all the flaws and is trying to do his best to address that. And how do we fill that gap is my question. You didn't have any prescriptions there in your presentation. And I wonder what can we do, right? I mean, you produce the best evidence that you can produce, and you put all the caveats about how the number of monitors has decreased, and that's why the reported death tolls have decreased. But, we know how policy-making processes and media reporting works. They don't really pay attention to those fine prints. So your numbers just take on their own life and shape the policies that come out of the discussion. So what do we do? Right? I mean, I guess all you can do is to try and do the best you can and add all these fine prints, but in your presentation. But what can we do to educate those policymakers? We should make it mandatory that all the members of Security Council at the UN watch or listen to your lecture before they make any decisions based on your statistical evidence. But I mean, I'm at a loss as to what we can do to change that. So I'd like to get your insight on what do you think might be a prescription for this situation. I'm going to stop here and let Andrew speak.
It's occurring to me, is this on? Okay. It's occurring to me that, Patrick, when you testify in a criminal tribunal, you probably only have one cross-examination, and here you get two. So I'm trying to...
Sometimes in one case there were 7 defendants, so there were 7.
Oh,
Don't worry, this is gentle.
Oh, that's good, because I was trying to figure out if I should be half as critical or twice as critical.
Twice.
In fact, I'm not going to be critical at all. I don't really have a critique to offer as much as a series of questions which actually reduce to one question. Why would it be essential to know the geographical distribution of mass killing in Kosovo? Why would it be essential to know the total number of state killings in Guatemala? Why would it be essential to render any sort of representation of a human rights violation as objective, as true, as proof? It seems to me that there's a context and a politics to that essentialness, that it has to do with producing some sort of sense that our decisions, our judgments, our actions can be based on some kind of extra discursive representation of the world. In other words, that we can permanently defer the sense that we have to decide and judge and act. And it seems to me that what's essential is coming to terms with the fact that we can never know and will never know in any essential way the geographical distribution of mass killings in Kosovo or the total number of state killings in Guatemala. And nevertheless, we have to decide, judge, and act in the full face of that undecidability. It seems to me that the project as I understand your project, which is to it seems to me, produce a more robust truth procedure by blending qualitative and quantitative analysis, still elides what I would regard as the politics of truth, or even the possibility that there is a politics of truth. And so my question is where for you is that politics? Is it inside or outside the work you do? My sense is that it's outside. My sense is that when you say that the flaw in statistical analysis is its status as an imperfect representation of the world, you still hold open the possibility that there is a perfect representation of the world. And I would translate that perfect representation as an apolitical representation. And it seems to me when you do that, then there's somehow the human rights violation, and human rights itself becomes somehow apolitical, objective, obvious, more natural than anything else in culture. To me, UN missions, NGO activities, truth commissions, criminal tribunals, all kinds of related activities that are pursued in the name of protecting human rights are not apolitical zones of knowledge production and knowledge consumption, but they're highly politicized enterprises, by which I mean they structure what counts as truth, what counts as error, what counts as information, what counts as data noise. And so what I wonder is whether bias is a condition that can be mastered in statistical analysis, or whether it would always be also, to some degree, outside that analysis in the condition that solicited that analysis in the first place. So I think, or I wonder, what acts of violence count as violations of human rights? What acts of violence count as defenses of human rights? Who or what has the right to advance answers to those questions? What kind of thought is allowed to serve as a basis for those answers? Can those answers be given in advance so that they're immune from subsequent negotiation or dispute, so that they serve as mere frameworks for the collection of data, for passing judgment? When I think about questions like that, it seems to me that it suggests that the world of human rights is an irreducibly political world, and that to think of that world otherwise is to allow politics, but also statistics, to pose themselves as speaking in the name of humanity for humanity. In other words, to allow politics and statistics to pass themselves off as apolitical. So I guess I'm also a little bit, let's say, to use Susan's word, nervous about making a distinction between qualitative claims and quantitative claims. Because you talked about qualitative claims as claims embedded in judgment and claims that solicited interpretation. And it seemed to me that, so that the distinction would be that quantitative claims are somehow are not embedded in judgment, do not solicit interpretation. Somehow they're embedded in the world. They tell us what the world looks like. And at the same time, those seemingly non-judgmental quantitative claims are made in the service of holding people accountable for their deeds. In other words, for passing judgment. So if a non-judgmental form of reasoning is used in the service of passing judgment, can that reasoning really be said to be non-judgmental? In raising these questions, I'm not suggesting, and I hope that's clear, that statistical analysis of human rights violations be ignored or discarded. I'm suggesting, on the contrary, that and this is, I think, where we agree, that it should be scrutinized as carefully as we can scrutinize it. But I guess what I find is sort of the yield or product of that scrutiny is maybe something different than you, because for me, what that scrutiny, what's really precious about a statistical analysis is not only what it tells us about the world, but what it tells us about we who solicit and use and believe in statistics and human rights and their intervention. I'll stop there, and I'll be very interested to hear a response.
Sure. First, I should claim the title that was offered earlier, that I am very much an entrepreneur of social memory, historical memory. So I can't remember, I think that was, it was your term. I suspect it was not offered flatteringly, but I'm happy to take that claim because I think that'll give me an entree into some of the questions that you've posed. So a lot of the questions that both of the commenters have suggested turn on this notion of what I mean by objectivity versus subjectivity, or quantitative versus qualitative. And first, I want to say that I mean a critique of a particular kind of naivete in quantitative approaches. That's really what my talk's about. I am not critiquing quantitative approaches in a broad sense, but that does not mean that I'm suggesting that quantitative approaches lead to some perfect truth. Quantitative approaches, I think, as anyone who studied them rigorously, and I invite you guys to the ISR, it's an amazing place, you learn that quantitative approaches take you to a probabilistic truth. They take you to a range of things which are true, but outside that range, things really unlikely to be true. Right? That's a very useful kind of way of understanding the world. That it's not that we get a specific thing that's true, but rather we get a range or a distribution of things which are true. And in modern, I think very recent approaches to statistics, we get actually a probability associated with each of the pieces of that range. We actually can, in a Bayesian approach, assign a probability to each point in that range. That's a very useful way to understand the world. It does not speak for itself, and that's why I said that in order to make an argument about accountability, we embed the quantitative reasoning in a series and an interdisciplinary approach. It is not by itself that any quantitative argument leads us to make determinations about guilt or innocence or even proportions of responsibility, but rather the quantitative piece is part of a broader argument with historians and anthropologists and a number of other disciplines, sociologists. And at its best, it looks something like, I think, the Peruvian or Guatemalan Truth Commissions. Those are the places where the two kinds of understanding the world complement each other best. That said, there is something quite different about the two approaches, which is that our claim to truth, we talked about the judgment, and I think we agree that the judgment and context are the ways that we ground the claim that a qualitative approach is true. The claim to a quantitative approach being true comes from reproducibility, sampling approaches, and methodology. A different kind of approach. Now, we can argue about how much judgment is involved in each of those pieces, but whether or not we agree that there's judgment involved in those pieces, someone else taking the same sampling approach, using the same methodology, would come up with the same graphs. Full stop. And that's just something so fundamentally different in these two approaches, I think we have to acknowledge it. Now, we can argue again about whether they're the right graphs. Fair enough. And then we go right back to the earlier piece where I said we have to embed the two positions together. But if we agree that this is the graph we want, and we agree that this is the appropriate sampling approach, and this is the methodology, no matter who does the study, you get to the same graph. And that's something that I think is really worth underlining as something that's quite different here. There's a much larger argument about the role of assumptions and bias, I think, in quantitative approaches. When I was in graduate school, more than 20 years ago at Michigan, and qualitative approaches were arguing with quantitative approaches, a very rich source of debate in the sociology department here at Michigan, as one might expect. It was a debate ender to say, but what are the assumptions? And I was paralyzed by that concern for a decade until I really started thinking about what quantitative people mean by the phrase assumptions. And in fact, in multiple systems estimation, we have 4 assumptions that in our team we repeat like a mantra. Do we have a closed universe? Do we have a homogeneity of capture probabilities across or within each of the systems? Do we have independence among the systems? Do we have perfect matching? Those are the 4 assumptions, and we spend endless weeks. Poor Danielle has so many times had me write back to him, have we looked at the independence assumption, and in 5 different ways. So we mean very specific things. By bias, we specifically mean social visibility. We mean how do we capture certain kinds of information and what other information is hidden from us. It's a very specific and technical sense of the word bias. If we don't control for bias, we're led to the weaknesses that I highlighted in my various examples. And unfortunately, I have several dozen more examples like those. Those are just the ones I have nice graphs for. But there are many, many more. So what happens after an analysis? I continue to be engaged in many of the places that we've worked, particularly in Kosovo. I've done a series of follow-up discussions. I'm headed to Belgrade next week to have another of these arguments about what actually happened in Kosovo with a lot of people who are engaged in the political argument around that. In other places, I wish I had been more engaged, and I haven't done as much as I should in Guatemala, in Peru, or in Timor-Leste. But what's interesting is that the reception of truth is, there is a very weak but present correlation between the reception of truth and the scientific quality of its production, I think. It's a weak correlation. It doesn't explain very much of the variance, but we get a little bit of explanatory power. Better science does sometimes lead to better sort of consensus around that being true. And I think Timor-Leste is the interesting example there. Before the Truth Commission, it was commonly suggested by people, by advocates in particular, that over 400,000 people had been killed by the Indonesians during the occupation between 1975 and 1999. That's off by a factor of 20. 20, not a little bit. Okay? About 18,000 people were killed during the occupation. It's about 18,004, and there's a confidence interval around that, but say roughly about 20,000 people were killed. Another 80 to 100,000 people died in excess of what we would have expected if peacetime mortality had obtained during the period, what epidemiologists call excess mortality. And those may be deaths attributable to the conflict, but a death attributable to the conflict is a very different kind of responsibility than a killing. And so we have very different, we should, I think, use quite different language about them. We may morally hold an occupying force responsible for both, and I think that's an appropriate discussion to have, but they're different things, and we should use different words for different things. So in Timor-Leste, I think the kind of political argument around the appropriate relationship to Indonesia has been deeply influenced by the Commission's findings, and I've been really excited to watch that debate evolve. Now, there's all sorts of other issues. Timor-Leste is a very contentious society, I think for good reasons, but nonetheless, this piece of it seems to be nailed down. And I think in the earlier discussion, Michael Ignatieff was quoted several times, and so I'd like to quote him again. I think one of the useful functions of a truth commission is to narrow the range of permissible lies. And I think that quantitative work does a great job on that. It's not that we eliminate them, but that we narrow the range. And that's consistent with my other claim that what we do with quantitative work is to come up with a distribution, a probability distribution that helps us to approximate that quantity. Maybe I should stop there.
Yeah, can we go to Q&A?
Sure.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So share a microphone among the three of you, okay? So why don't we go with, let's make sure you speak in the microphone, okay?
All right. Hi, Patrick.
Hello.
Good to see you, Juan Cole.
Yeah, it's been a long time.
Yes, you didn't bring up about Iraq.
Pardon me?
You didn't bring up about Iraq.
I would love to talk about Iraq. Thank you
Yes,
so
I'm
much.
going to give you that opportunity. You know what I'm talking about. I mean, there's this vast range of estimates of
Yeah.
excess mortality,
Right.
how many people, actually, as I remember that 2006 study at MIT, their long-form interviewing suggested that most of the excess mortality was in fact military violence, but there was some from, potable water issues and things like that. But anyway, as far as I can tell, the estimates range from 100,000 to 1.2 million. And that's unacceptable, and I think fits very well with the spirit of your discussion today.
Yeah, it is unacceptable. And the part of the reason that the range is so great is that they're counting different things. They're not counting the same thing at all. The 1.2 million stuff, I think, is not plausible. But the estimate from the Johns Hopkins guys, which I think is the plausible top end, it's years old, was around 600 or 650,000. And the estimate from the Iraq body count and the Brookings studies, which use press data to aggregate numbers of deaths, come in around 100,000, or actually a little bit more now. And then we have now the third data source, which is by far my favorite of the three, the U.S. Military Significant Acts database, which WikiLeaks very helpfully provided to us in the scientific community. I'm deeply grateful to them for that. It shows about 65 to 70,000 deaths. The Iraq body count and the Significant Acts databases are looking at killings. Okay? The Johns Hopkins people are including killings as a subcategory, but they're estimating excess deaths. There has been tremendous controversy around the Johns Hopkins study, and I've tried to remain aloof from that because I know and like the guys who did it, but they made some big mistakes. They made significant, substantial, important technical mistakes in the execution of that survey, which one might try to excuse as a result of the difficulty of doing that survey, but does not excuse it from the point of view of the level of politicization that they brought to it when they published it. So unfortunately, I have to say I don't really find the high-end estimates as credible as I did actually when I first read the study. When I first read the study, it looked pretty good. But then a lot of things have come to light since then that make me think, well, there are enough mistakes there that I think that's probably not a reasonable estimate. But if we look, what I'd rather do instead of talking about magnitude, which I do not think is a useful thing to do with quantitative estimates, it's a politically helpful thing to do. It looks good in the newspaper. It gets you published. Pattern is much more important. And so Iraq provides us this fascinating example of pattern mistakes. And the pattern mistake in Iraq is about who were the perpetrators. So if we look at the published data, whether it's the Iraq body count or the significant acts database, that on specific enumerations rather than a probability approach that's in the surveys, specific enumerations, these are people who try to write down every death, every single death. And enumeration-centered approaches are useful at telling us what we can observe. They're not as good at telling us what we don't observe. And so if we take the enumeration approach as what's true, what we confuse is what's visible with what's true. And Iraq gives us this amazing example of that, because if we put the two data sets together, we match them together, and we look at different kinds of events, particularly by size. So we look at big events where 20 or more people are killed versus small events where 1 or 2 people are killed. And we ask ourselves the question, what is the probability that we know this event? The probability that we know big events is almost 1. We know them all. When a bomb goes off in a market, we're going to hear about it, and we're going to know many, if not all, the victims. We're going to know a lot about it. When one person gets killed, we don't generally hear about it. The probability of reporting is somewhere between 0.2 and 0.6, and it's very hard to nail down. But it's much, much, much lower. And what's interesting then is to ask, well, how does that condition what we conclude about Iraq? And how does this, for example, fundamentally weaken the coalition's ability to provide security to ordinary Iraqis during the period that I'm talking about here, which is really 2004 to 2007. After 2007, by 2008, 2009, it starts to improve. But 2004 to 2007, how is that weakened? Well, what I think happened is that people, for political reasons as well, over-focused on the big events. They got tunnel vision on the big events. And they tended to ignore the small events, which is important because the small events are committed by different people than the big events. The small events are committed by local militias, what in Central America we would have called death squads. They're death squads who are hiding people's bodies after they kill them. Big events happen in public. TV cameras come, they take photos of it, people interview the injured survivors and so forth. We hear a lot about it. So we focus on the big events. Who's committing the big events? International actors. Okay? So there's international insurgent groups and coalition forces are the ones committing the big events. Who are committing the small events? Local actors. But ordinary Iraqis tell everyone who will listen that the people they're really worried about are the militias, because they're coming to kill my husband, right? I mean, they're people that they know about. That's a very targeted, personal kind of threat. So what happens is that by looking at these big picture data sources, we missed the story. We misunderstood what's going on. So I think for me, that's the piece of Iraq that's really interesting, not the top level number, although I still don't think we know. We could know, though, because by using the same method that I've used in a very approximate way to estimate the probability of event size, probability of reporting by event size, we could use that to make an estimate of the total. And there's the technical term would be it's going north, a thumbsuck number that you could get out of that. But I won't say that in front of an open mic.
Okay.
So, it's good to see you again.
Yeah, wait, could you use the microphone, please?
Forgot about that.
Thank you. Hi, I have a very simple question. I was struck by the fact that when you spoke about cases where you have something approximating perfect data, like perfect census, well, there's differences. Some cases you do, some cases you don't. And you mentioned, I think, Northern Ireland, you mentioned Israel, Palestine, and maybe you mentioned Bosnia, I don't remember.
I did.
As the 3 cases that are approximating, I understand.
Say within 5%.
Perfect data. I was wondering why these places have perfect data. Is that a function of the state's operation there and collecting data? What is that a function of? Why in these cases do we have what we can learn from that fact itself? I found that interesting. That's all.
I think that the 3 cases are super different, and the one that I know pretty well is Bosnia. I don't know the other 2 as well. I've just looked at a bunch of other studies around them. The Bosnian case comes from an especially entrepreneurial group that did both real-time documentation during the conflict and then spent many years and enormous resources and attention to document everything. But the precondition that all three of those countries share is a highly literate society. That's a really big step. You've got to have people who can write stuff down locally, because oral history is just not that great for remembering these deaths. I've done a lot of work in Congo and in Timor-Leste. It's a lot harder to get facts about the past if people don't write them down. The second thing that's good is registration societies. Societies where there's a lot of state documentation of existence. That's also important. It tends to correlate strongly with literate societies, but it produces a different kind of information. So what that does is leave you a trace of someone's existence, and that trace can be tracked down in useful ways, even when there's a systematic destruction of civil registries, which in the Balkans, it was an interesting and fascinating feature of all the different pieces of conflict in the Balkans, is that there were systematic destructions of public registries. And so what does that mean? That we have like 1 or 2 cases of that in Guatemala, but for the most part, it went the other way. I mean, even you'd have military commissioners documenting killings that the military themselves committed. It's kind of bizarre. And I think the third piece that is required for that level of documentation is enough openness in the society, or at least a hypocritical openness in society, to allow the documentation. I wrote my dissertation about the difference between state violence, the practice of state violence, and the practice of responding to state violence in a human rights framework between El Salvador and Ethiopia. And I'd worked in both places, and I found in El Salvador there was this tremendous richness of civil society resistance using human rights language to state violence, and between 1977 and 1983 was the period I was looking at. Whereas in Ethiopia there was almost none. There's really nothing from civil society. There were a couple of sort of in the context of Ethiopia, counter-revolutionary groups, but they didn't document anything. They never used the language of civil society. And when I met some people who were veterans of those groups, almost 20 years later, they still laughed at the idea of human rights. It just didn't make any sense at all to them. And so I asked why that was, and my conclusion is it has to do with the hypocrisy of the state. That when a state promises to respect rights and then blows that off, it opens space for organizing around that topic. You can call the state to account on its own terms, which is very powerful someplace like South Africa or the Philippines or El Salvador, but was essentially useless to you someplace like Ethiopia. And then mixed use post-Helsinki in the Eastern Bloc and in Pakistan, which was my intermediate case. So that hypocrisy is actually really important to get this kind of near perfect documentation. Just to close that, because I can see kind of you don't know if the documentation is perfect until you've done one of the inferential mathematical statistical approaches to show that there isn't more that you're missing. And that was done in Bosnia, and I think it's been done in Northern Ireland. I know someone who told me about a project that she knows about. So.
Okay, last question. Deanna, just the woman right here.
Just a comment first. When you're talking about Guatemala, we sent a group, so that'll be 30 years ago, and the purpose was, let's find out just what's going on. And then about 10 years ago, 7 years, we had Stephen Lewis, former ambassador, come in tears about women's rape in war, what they call war or conflict. And then we had leader of Doctors Without Borders coming, and the idea is people are not waiting for the statistics, they're going out and doing something, which we all know. And that may be based on inappropriate statistics, and it's certainly biased. My question is, and also, of course, we went into every possible organization we could and groups, and to kind of educate, right? And I brought it into the school system because start educating our young. My question is, waiting for statistics, do you fear that may cause people, especially with so much going on with the media now, we know everything the next day or within an hour. People will say, well, I'm just going to sit back and wait and see what Patrick Ball, what he comes up with. There are people who will continue doing what they should do. And as you say, the United Nations is waiting for the right numbers. I think it may, I'm not saying you're causing that, but there is going to be a certain group that are just getting too much information coming in and say, I'm going to wait for the statistics and really find out what's going on.
Well, I don't think we need to wait for statistics anymore. I mean, we know on a monthly basis how much homicide's happening in Syria right now. We have really, really good data on Syria. I don't know how good it is, and I'm starting work on that project right now, but I don't think we really need to wait that much anymore. The Central American cases that we did wait for, we waited decades for, we waited decades not for quantitative or statistical reasons, we waited for political reasons. We waited for the truth-telling processes to give us opportunities to tell those stories. But, you know, in 1991, I worked for a Salvadoran non-government organization that had been doing real-time documentation throughout the conflict. And they wrote in 1986 what I think is still my favorite human rights report of all time, called Torture in El Salvador. And it's my favorite because these guys did amazing. They interviewed everyone they were political prisoners. They interviewed everybody in the prison they were in and documented every kind of torture that they could find in the interviews that they did in that prison, and then made little graphs of the kinds of torture. It's an astonishing report done in prison with, I think, a very high level of methodological rigor. So I think it's an error to say that we have to wait for statistics. Now, are we overwhelmed with information? For sure. And is all information good? No. More information is not better. More information makes a lot of these problems worse, and I think there's a bunch of technical projects in our area in human rights right now which are confusing things by producing what I think is naive data. We do have to do the modeling in order to unpack what the data is trying to tell us. It cannot be read off by simply counting. And that was part of the message I was trying to suggest. There are only 3 ways to reliable statistics: censuses, sampling modeling, or random sampling, or some variant in random sampling. So if we don't have one of those things, we really don't have statistics. What we know is what we have observed. We know about this many cases, but that doesn't give us any ability either to address magnitude or to address pattern, because we don't know how social visibility is conditioning what we see and what we don't see. So it's very, very, very difficult. I would never counsel people to wait. You know, God's forbid that anybody should do that. We should act, but we act on the basis of judgment. We act on the basis of an informed statement of observation, which is different than a statistical claim. That's not to say it's weaker, it's just different. And we need to respect it, we need to honor it, and we need to listen to it. I think this is what Human Rights Watch does. I think this is what most local NGOs that I've worked with over the years do, and I honor it. And I think that we should all be listening to it.
Okay. Thank you, Patrick, and to our 2 discussants. Thank you very much.